The man my daughter was about to marry had done this before. 2 women, 2 weddings, 2 bank accounts drained before the ink on the divorce papers dried. I found out 3 weeks before the ceremony, and I had to decide, do I save her or do I let her learn the hardest way possible? The roast had been in the oven for 40 minutes when I heard the car. Not just any car, Stephanie's car. I knew it the way mothers know these things, by the particular rhythm of the engine as it slowed at the corner, by the soft crunch of tires on the gravel patch at the edge of my driveway that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. I wiped my hands on the dish towel, checked the oven one more time, and told myself to stop being ridiculous. She had called 3 days ago, her voice carrying that careful brightness it gets when she's about to ask me something she's not sure about. "Mom, I want you to meet someone. His name is James. I really think this one is different." I had said, of course, come Sunday, I'll make the pot roast. And then I'd stood at the kitchen sink for a long moment, looking out at the garden Thomas planted the year before he got sick, and breathed. 8 years alone teaches you a great deal about hope. It teaches you to hold it gently. I heard the car door, then another one. I smoothed my apron, walked to the front of the house, and opened the door before they reached the porch steps. Old habit, something my mother always did, the idea being that you greet people before they have to knock, before they have to wait. Because waiting on a porch tells a person something about how welcome they are. Stephanie came first, the way she always does, slightly ahead of whoever she's with, like she's clearing a path. She was wearing the blue cardigan I gave her 2 Christmases ago, which meant something, though I wasn't sure what. Behind her was James. He was tall, taller than I'd pictured from her descriptions. Dark hair, neat without being fussy. He was carrying a bottle of wine in one hand and a small bunch of dahlias in the other, the kind from an actual florist, not a gas station, wrapped in brown paper with the stems cut at a clean angle. He was smiling before I even made eye contact. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people wait until they're introduced to commit to a full smile. There's a natural hesitation, the reading of the room, the checking of signals. James smiled before he had any signals at all. It was a complete, practiced, ready-made smile, the kind that arrives too early and stays too long. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, extending the dahlias, "Stephanie talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." His voice was warm, well-modulated, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has learned exactly how much warmth to put into it. I thanked him for the flowers, stepped aside, and let them in. The evening moved the way these evenings do, slowly at first, then all at once. I set the table while Stephanie poured the wine James had brought, something from a vineyard in the hill country of Texas, good without being showy. James offered to help, and when I told him I had it handled, he didn't push, which I noted. He sat at the kitchen table instead, asking questions about the house, about the neighborhood, about how long I'd lived here. 31 years, I told him. "It shows," he said, looking around the kitchen. "In the best way. A house that's been lived in well has a different feel to it." It was exactly the right thing to say. That was the second thing I noticed. Every response James gave was exactly right, not approximately right, not close exact. The right amount of interest, the right amount of deference, the right questions at the right intervals. He complimented the roast without overdoing it. He asked about my years as a nurse with genuine seeming curiosity. He listened to Stephanie's stories with the focused attention of a man who wanted to be seen listening. I watched him the way I used to watch patients in the early hours of a shift, not intrusively, just steadily, the way you watch something you're trying to understand. His mouth smiled throughout dinner. His eyes did not. I don't mean that he seemed cold or calculating or unkind. If you had been sitting at that table, you would have left thinking, what a lovely young man, what a perfect match, how lucky Stephanie is. The eyes were pleasant enough. They moved correctly, landed in the right places, held contact for appropriate lengths of time. But there was something behind them that never quite changed, regardless of what was happening at the table. A steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with control. Thomas used to say, and he said it so often, it became something close to a family motto, "Eyes don't lie, Ruth. Smiles do." He'd learned it young, growing up in a house where the smiles were frequent and the eyes told an entirely different story. It was the lens through which he read people for the rest of his life, and somewhere over 40 years of marriage, I had borrowed it for my own. Dessert was the peach cobbler I'd made from scratch, the one Stephanie has requested since she was 9 years old, and James had 2 helpings and said it was the best thing he'd eaten in recent memory. Stephanie laughed and leaned into him, and the picture of them together was genuinely lovely. My daughter, happy, soft, in a way she doesn't always let herself be. I wanted to simply enjoy that. I mostly did. It was near the end of the evening, while I was clearing plates, that it happened. Our dog, Thomas's dog, really. A 10-year-old beagle who has slept on the same side of the couch for a decade and regards most visitors with dignified indifference, wandered in from the hallway and went directly to James. James looked down and said, without any hesitation, without any introduction from either of us, "Hey, Biscuit." The name? His name. Stephanie hadn't called the dog by name all evening. I certainly hadn't. Biscuit's name was not something I had mentioned in any phone call or prior conversation I could recall. It was simply the name of my dog, known to people who had been in this house, and James had never been in this house before tonight. I set the plates down carefully, kept my expression where it was, and said nothing. The evening ended pleasantly. James helped carry dishes to the sink despite my insistence that he didn't need to. He thanked me twice for the meal, once at the table and once at the door. He shook my hand, which felt deliberate, not unfriendly, just deliberate, and told me he hoped this was the first of many Sunday dinners. I hope so too, I said. And I meant the words, I did. But as I watched their car reverse out of my driveway and disappear around the corner, I stood on the porch in the October dark and turned the same question over in my mind, the way you turn something small and sharp in your hand, carefully, trying to understand its edges. How did he know that? The chair was the first thing I saw when I came downstairs. It sits in the corner of the living room, angled toward the window the way Thomas always positioned it. He liked to read, with the afternoon light coming in from the left. It's a wingback, dark green, worn at the armrests in the way that speaks of years of use rather than neglect. After he passed, I thought about moving it, donating it, doing the sensible things people suggest when they tell you that holding on to objects isn't the same as holding on to the person. I never did any of those things. Last night, James had sat in it without asking. It happened after dinner. When we moved to the living room, Stephanie took the small sofa. I settled into my usual chair, and James looked around, assessed the seating with that quiet efficiency he seemed to apply to everything, and chose Thomas's chair. He sat in it comfortably, naturally, as though it were simply the nearest available piece of furniture, which, of course, it was. I told myself that. I told myself it was unreasonable to expect a stranger to understand the weight of a chair he'd never been told about. But I had watched him settle into it, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, one arm resting along the worn green armrest, and felt something in my chest go quiet in a way that was hard to name. This morning, with October light coming sideways through the kitchen windows and coffee in my hands, I stood in the doorway and looked at that chair for a long time. And I thought about Thomas. He was 59 when they found it. Pancreatic, the doctor said, with the careful directness of someone who has learned that softening certain words doesn't actually soften them. Thomas reached over and took my hand, and the first thing he said was, "Well, we'd better make the most of what we've got." That was Thomas. Not bravado, just an honest accounting of the situation and an immediate decision about how to meet it. We had 14 months. They were not easy months, but they were full ones. We said the things that needed saying. We went back to the stretch of coast in the Outer Banks, where we'd spent our honeymoon and sat on a rented porch watching the water and not talking much, because by then we didn't need to. When he passed, it was a Tuesday morning in March, quieter than I expected. Stephanie had flown in from Charlotte the week before. I was holding his hand. Afterwards came the particular quiet that doesn't feel like peace. The casseroles from neighbors, the sympathy cards, the long afternoons in a house that was the same in every physical detail and entirely different in every way that mattered. Stephanie stayed 2 weeks. Then she had to go back her job, her life, the forward motion that grief eventually demands of the living. She called every Sunday the first year, then every other Sunday. Then, when she could, I want to be careful not to make that sound like abandonment, because it wasn't. Stephanie loved me. She called on birthdays, visited at Thanksgiving, came in the spring when the azaleas bloomed. But there is a difference between love and presence. What we had settled into over the years was love without much presence, the kind that sustains itself on good intentions and the assumption that closeness, once built, doesn't require regular tending. I had told myself that was enough, that it was simply the shape of adult life. Standing in the doorway this morning, looking at Thomas's chair, I wasn't so sure. Because watching Stephanie last night, the way she angled herself toward James, reached for his hand before her wine glass, laughed at things he said a half second before they were funny, I had seen something I recognized. A woman reorganizing herself around another person, rearranging her interior landscape to make room for someone new. I had done the same thing once, with Thomas, and it had been the best decision of my life. But Thomas had been worth rearranging for. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and walked to the kitchen table to collect yesterday's mail. Bills, a catalog, and the monthly statement from my bank, folded in its familiar window envelope. I opened it the way I always did Monday mornings, running my eyes down the column of figures with the automatic attention of someone who had managed her own finances alone for 8 years and took quiet pride in knowing her numbers. I ran the column twice. Then I set the statement on the table, smoothed it flat, and looked at the final balance. It was smaller than I remembered. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm a stranger, but I knew my account the way I knew this house, by feel, by rhythm, by the steady accumulated knowledge of years. And the number on that page was not the number I carried in my head. I sat down slowly. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder Thomas had built and hung from the oak tree the spring before he got sick, very red against the gray October morning. It sat for a moment, then it was gone. I looked at the statement again. The number was still wrong. The bank statement had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Ruth Ann picked it up again that Tuesday morning, the same way she had picked it up Monday and the Monday before that carefully, like it might say something different if she held it at the right angle. The number was still there, smaller than she expected. Not dramatically smaller, just enough to make her pause. She set it down and told herself what she had been telling herself all week. She must have miscounted. She was 67 years old and had managed her own finances for 8 years without a single overdraft. Surely she had simply forgotten a charge somewhere. A subscription she no longer used, a utility adjustment she hadn't tracked. It happened. She made her coffee and let it go. James had been around for 6 weeks now, and she had to admit reluctantly, the way you admit something that makes you feel ungrateful, that he was very good at being present. Not intrusive, not performative. Just consistently, quietly helpful in ways that were difficult to argue with. He had noticed, without being told, that she preferred the back burner on the stove because the front left one ran a little hot. He had tightened the hinge on the screen door one afternoon while waiting for Stephanie to finish getting ready, without mentioning it before or after. He remembered that she took her tea without sugar and that she didn't like the television on during dinner. Small things. Accurate things. Ruth Ann had spent 31 years as a nurse. She knew the difference between someone who paid attention and someone who had done their research. Paying attention happened in real time. It was reactive, imperfect, occasionally wrong. Research was something else. Research looked like attention but arrived too quickly, too precisely, without the usual margin of error that genuine observation carried. James was never wrong. That was the thing she kept coming back to. In 6 weeks, he had not once misremembered a preference, misread a mood, or offered a suggestion that didn't land exactly right. He knew she liked her eggs, scrambled soft, not firm. He knew she kept the thermostat at 68. He knew she didn't enjoy talking about Thomas, not because anyone had told him, but because he simply never brought it up, which was, in its own quiet way, more telling than if he had. Stephanie called less. Ruth Ann had noticed it the way you notice weather changing gradually. Then all at once, their Sunday calls had shifted to Saturday, then to whenever Stephanie had a free moment, then to brief check-ins that lasted 5 minutes and covered nothing of substance. When they did talk, Stephanie used phrases Ruth Ann didn't recognize as hers. At the end of the day, it's about the bigger picture. I just think we need to be practical, clean, efficient phrases that sounded borrowed. She didn't say anything about it. She listened, asked a question or two, and said she was glad Stephanie sounded well. The 3 of them had dinner together again that Friday. James grilled salmon on the back porch, and Ruth Ann sat at the table she had eaten at for 30 years and watched him move around her kitchen with a familiarity that should have taken longer to develop. He refilled her water glass before she reached for it. He handed her the serving spoon before she asked. After dinner, while Stephanie cleared the plates, James sat across from Ruth Ann at the kitchen table and mentioned, casually, that he had been thinking about something. "I've been helping Stephanie look at some long-term options," he said, "and I just want to make sure you're protected too. A lot of people your age have savings sitting in places that aren't working as hard as they could be. I'd be happy to take a look if you'd ever want a second set of eyes." His tone was even and unhurried. Nothing in it suggested pressure. Everything in it had been chosen carefully. Ruth Ann set down her coffee cup. She looked at him the way she used to look at patients who described symptoms that didn't quite add up attentively, without expression, running the information against what she already knew. "That's kind of you," she said. "But I've had the same financial arrangement for years, and it suits me fine." "Of course," he nodded immediately. "No resistance, just wanted you to know the offer stands." Stephanie came back with clean glasses. The conversation moved on. The evening ended pleasantly, the way the evenings always ended pleasantly. Ruth Ann walked them to the door. She watched the car back down the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the oak tree Thomas had planted the year Stephanie was born. Then she went inside, washed the remaining dishes, and was halfway up the stairs when she heard it. James's voice, low and even, drifting from the front porch. He must have stepped back out to make a call while Stephanie waited in the car. Ruth Ann stood still on the third step. She couldn't make out every word. The night air carried sound unevenly, and she had learned long ago not to fill in gaps with assumptions. But 3 words arrived clearly enough that she had no need to fill in anything. "She doesn't suspect." The porch light clicked off. Ruth Ann stood in the dark stairwell for a long moment, her hand on the banister, her coffee gone cold in the cup she was still holding. Then she went upstairs, set the cup on the nightstand, and did not sleep for a very long time. The house was exactly as she had left it the night before. Same curtains, same oak floors she had swept Tuesday morning, same ceramic rooster on the windowsill that Thomas had bought at a roadside market outside Savannah 30 years ago, and she had never once considered moving. Everything in its place, unchanged, familiar in the specific way a home becomes familiar when you have lived in it long enough to stop seeing it clearly. But something was different. Ruth Ann sat at the window with her first cup of coffee and tried to name it. Not a sound, not a smell, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that is what shifted." It was more like the particular quiet that settles into a house when someone has recently been in it without your knowledge. A quality to the air that you couldn't measure, but couldn't quite dismiss. She had felt it once before. The week after Thomas died, when the house had rearranged itself around his absence without anyone moving a single thing, she took a long sip of coffee and told herself she was being dramatic. Stephanie had canceled their Thursday lunch for the 3rd time in 6 weeks. The first cancellation had been a work conflict, reasonable, last minute, the kind that happened. The second had been a headache that turned into an early night. This one was James. He had apparently arranged something for the two of them, a day trip she hadn't known about, and Stephanie had called Tuesday evening with an apology that was warm but brief. "I'll make it up to you, Mom. I promise." Ruth Ann had said, of course, not to worry, that there would be other Thursdays. And there would be. That wasn't the point. The point was the pattern: 3 consecutive plans, 3 consecutive cancellations, each one with a reason that was perfectly reasonable on its own. It was only when you lined them up and looked at them together that the shape became visible. She had called Stephanie back that same afternoon, just to check in. The conversation was pleasant enough. Stephanie asked about the garden, about whether Ruth Ann had seen the new neighbors on Elm Street, about a television series she thought her mother might enjoy. Normal questions. Familiar rhythm. Except Stephanie paused before answering things. Not long, pauses a beat. Maybe 2, the kind of pause that could mean anything. Distraction, fatigue, searching for the right word. But Ruth Ann had spent 31 years reading patients who said one thing and meant another, and she recognized the pause of a person who was considering their response before giving it. Stephanie had never done that before. She had always talked the way she had always talked, quickly, circling back, interrupting herself, following one thought into the middle of another. It was her nature. It was the reason Thomas had called her his little radio when she was small, because she was always broadcasting on multiple frequencies at once. The measured pauses were new. Ruth Ann was out front on Wednesday afternoon, deadheading the hydrangeas along the porch railing, when her neighbor Norma came down the sidewalk with her small tan dog on a leash. Norma, 71, retired schoolteacher. the kind of woman who noticed everything and mentioned most of it slowed when she saw Ruth Ann. They talked for a few minutes about the hydrangeas, about Norma's dog's recent aversion to squirrels, about the new coffee shop that had opened on the main road. Then, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, Norma mentioned that she had seen Stephanie's young man parking outside the law offices on Patterson Street. Twice in the past 2 weeks. "Nice-looking fellow," Norma said. "Drives that silver car. I figured he must be handling something for your family." Ruth Ann said she imagined that must be it. She thanked Norma for stopping and went back to the hydrangeas. She stood there for a moment after Norma moved on, her clippers open and still in her hand. James had not mentioned visiting any attorney. Stephanie had not mentioned it either. It was possible it was nothing, a personal legal matter, a contract for work, any number of ordinary things that people handled with lawyers every week without announcing it at dinner. Ruth Ann knew that. She also knew that the second time something appeared without explanation, it stopped being a coincidence and started being a pattern. That evening, a small package arrived on her doorstep. No card, only a handwritten note in an envelope tucked under the ribbon. "Thought this might be useful, James." Inside was a paperback book with a muted blue cover. A guide to a state organization, written for people in their 60s and 70s. Practical looking, well reviewed, according to the back. Ruth Ann set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she said thank you in a text message, because it was the polite thing to do, and she placed the book on the shelf beside the cookbooks Thomas had never used, spine facing out, exactly where anyone could see she had kept it. She did not open it. She was still thinking about Patterson Street when her phone rang at 7:30. "Stephanie," she answered on the second ring. "Mom." Her daughter's voice was bright in a way that sounded rehearsed. "I have something to tell you." Ruth Ann sat down slowly in the chair nearest the window. "James proposed," Stephanie said. "We want to get married in 4 months." The oak tree outside was perfectly still in the evening air. Ruth Ann looked at it and said, "Tell me everything." 4 months. Ruth Ann stood at the kitchen counter the next morning and looked at the calendar on the wall, the same paper calendar she had bought at the drugstore every January for the past 12 years, the kind with photographs of Carolina landscapes and large print blocks for each date. She counted the squares forward from where she stood. 4 months was not very long. She had known couples who dated for 4 months before getting engaged. She had known couples who were engaged for 4 years before marrying. Neither was inherently wrong, but there was a particular quality to the speed of this announced casually over the phone, as if the timeline were already decided and she was simply being informed, that sat uneasily with her. She took her coffee out to the back porch and watched the yard come into the morning light. They arrived at 1:30. Stephanie wore a light blue dress Ruth Ann hadn't seen before. The ring was simple, a round stone set low on a plain band, tasteful in the way that suggested someone had chosen it carefully with another person's preferences in mind. Stephanie's preferences, presumably, although Ruth Ann found herself noting that it bore no resemblance to the vintage setting Stephanie had admired once, years ago, in a shop window on King Street. She had pointed it out to Ruth Ann and said, "Someday, something like that." She had been 26. James shook Ruth Ann's hand at the door and said it was good to see her. He brought flowers again, white this time, wrapped in brown paper, and set them on the counter with the ease of someone who had been setting things on that counter for years. They sat in the living room. Stephanie talked about the proposal, a quiet evening, a walk along the waterfront, nothing elaborate. She smiled while she described it, and the smile reached her eyes, which Ruth Ann noticed and held on to like a fixed point in the middle of uncertain water. Then Ruth Ann asked the question she had been holding since the phone call the night before. "Why so fast?" The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Stephanie opened her mouth. Then her eyes moved just briefly, barely a flicker, to James, sitting beside her on the sofa. James answered. "We're both at a point in our lives where we know what we want," he said, his voice carrying the unhurried confidence of someone who had considered the question in advance. "Stephanie and I have talked about it extensively. Waiting feels more like habit than intention for most people. We'd rather be deliberate." It was a good answer, thoughtful. The kind of answer that was difficult to argue with because it had been designed that way. Ruth Ann looked at her daughter. Stephanie nodded once and picked up her coffee cup. The rest of the afternoon moved pleasantly. James talked about the venue they had in mind, a historic property outside of town, nothing too formal, and about a small guest list, family and close friends only. He asked Ruth Ann whether she preferred a morning or afternoon ceremony, as if her preference genuinely factored into an equation he was building. She said afternoon, because it was the truthful answer, and she watched him file it away. When they left at 4, Stephanie hugged her at the door and held on a moment longer than usual. Ruth Ann hugged her back and said she was happy for her. She meant part of that, and she let herself mean it. After the car disappeared down the street, she went to the bedroom. In the small wooden box on her dresser, the one with the brass clasp that Thomas had given her the Christmas Stephanie was for, she kept 2 things. Her own wedding band, which she had moved to her right hand for a year after Thomas passed, and then removed entirely when the weight of it in that wrong place became more painful than the absence. And Thomas's ring, plain gold, worn thin on the underside from 34 years of wear. She held them both in her palm and stood at the window for a long time. She was not opposed to Stephanie getting married. She was not opposed to James, not in any way she could fully justify. She was opposed to the version of her daughter who looked sideways before speaking, who borrowed phrases that weren't hers, who had stopped calling on Sunday mornings for no reason that had ever been explained. She placed the rings back in the box and closed the clasp. That evening, she sat at the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one she used for bills and correspondence and the occasional letter she still wrote by hand, and opened her laptop. She typed his name into the search field the way she typed anything, deliberately, without hurry. James Fowler. The results were ordinary at first. A professional profile, a few business listings, a photograph in a group setting, corporate, dated 2 years prior. She scrolled past them. Then she saw it, a link to an archived article from an Atlanta publication. The headline was brief. She read the first line. Her phone rang. Stephanie's name on the screen, bright and familiar. Ruth Ann looked at the article. She looked at the phone. She closed the laptop halfway, leaving the page exactly where it was, and answered. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "I was just thinking about you." She had left the laptop on the desk, screen down, the way you leave something you intend to return to but aren't ready to face. At 5:43 in the morning, before the mockingbirds started and before the light changed from gray to gold, Ruth Ann sat down at the desk and opened it. The article was still there. The browser had kept the page exactly where she had left it, the cursor blinking patiently beside the first sentence she had read before the phone interrupted her. She had spent the better part of the previous evening talking to Stephanie about centerpiece options and whether a Saturday or Sunday ceremony was more practical for out-of-town guests, and through all of it, the laptop had been sitting on the desk, closed, waiting. She read the article from the beginning. It was short archived from a small Atlanta publication, the kind of local outlet that covered city council meetings and business openings and, occasionally, legal disputes that didn't make the larger papers. The piece was 18 months old. It described a civil matter, a financial disagreement between 2 private parties, settled without going to trial, terms undisclosed, no criminal finding, no formal judgment. The name James Fowler appeared once, as a respondent. The name of the other party appeared twice. Claire Donnelly. That was all. No photographs, no follow-up coverage, no additional context. The article said only that the matter had been resolved and that neither party had issued a public statement. Ruth Ann read it 3 times. She was not a person who drew conclusions from incomplete information. That had been one of Thomas's observations about her, offered with admiration rather than criticism. You don't assume, Ruth. You wait until you know. 31 years of nursing had reinforced the habit. A symptom was not a diagnosis. A single data point was not a pattern. But she had 2 data points now. The careful perfection of a man who knew too much too quickly, and a legal dispute settled quietly, without explanation involving a woman whose name she didn't recognize. That was not a conclusion, but it was enough to make her stop waiting. She called Beverly Hayes at 8 o'clock that morning, after calculating that Beverly would be up but not yet at the office. They had been friends for going on 22 years since the spring. Ruth Ann had moved into her current house in Beverly, then newly arrived in Charleston for a bank position she said was temporary, and had since held for 2 decades, had appeared at her door with a casserole dish and a matter-of-fact handshake. Beverly was 64, practical in the way that people who had worked in finance long enough became practical, and she did not embellish. Ruth Ann asked how she was. They talked for a few minutes about Beverly's sister's knee surgery and about the heat that had arrived too early this year. Then, finding her way into it, the way she found her way into difficult conversations through the side door rather than the front, Ruth Ann mentioned that Stephanie was getting married. Beverly said she hadn't heard. Congratulations. Ruth Ann mentioned the fiancé's name. There was a pause. Not a conversational pause. Not the half-second gap of someone gathering a thought. A full, weighted silence that lasted long enough for Ruth Ann to hear the faint sound of Beverly setting something down on a hard surface. "I think we should meet in person," Beverly said. They met at Beverly's kitchen table at 6:30 that evening. Beverly poured coffee without asking and sat down across from Ruth Ann with a folder that she had clearly prepared in advance. She explained, briefly and without drama, that she had seen James Fowler's name attached to a newly opened account at her branch opened within the same week. Beverly said that he had first appeared in Stephanie's life based on what Stephanie had mentioned to Beverly's colleague at a lunch the previous fall. The account itself was unremarkable, small deposits, consistent with a person establishing local financial presence in a new city. But attached to it, labeled in the memo field as shared expenses, were 2 transfers from a separate account. An account in Stephanie's name. The amounts were not large. That was the part Beverly said she wanted Ruth Ann to understand. Not large enough to trigger any automatic review. Small enough to seem like exactly what the label suggested: 2 people building a life together, splitting routine costs. The kind of transaction that no one looked at twice. Ruth Ann looked at them twice. She asked Beverly how long the transfers had been occurring. Beverly said since shortly after Stephanie first mentioned James to her colleague. 8 months. Ruth Ann sat with that for a moment. Then Beverly opened the folder to the second page and placed it on the table between them. A name, written in Beverly's precise handwriting on an otherwise blank piece of paper. Below it, an address in Atlanta. Below that, a phone number. Claire Donnelly. Ruth Ann looked at Beverly. Beverly looked back. "She filed a complaint through a financial mediation office 14 months ago," Beverly said. "My colleague knew someone involved in the review. The complaint was withdrawn, but the name stayed in the system." She paused. "She's been trying to find him for 3 years," Beverly said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Ruth Ann folded the piece of paper carefully along its existing crease and placed it in the front pocket of her cardigan, where she kept things she did not want to lose. The piece of paper had spent the night in her cardigan pocket, and Ruth Ann had spent the night in the armchair beside the bedroom window, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, the kind of suspended stillness that sometimes passed for rest when the mind refused to fully release. By 7 in the morning she had made coffee, fed Biscuit, and carried both herself and the folded paper out to the front porch. She sat in the wooden rocker she had owned since before Stephanie was born and held the paper open in her lap, the way you hold something you have committed to reading but have not yet started. The number was in Beverly's precise handwriting, an Atlanta area code, a name above it. She rocked once, slowly. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. It rang 4 times. She was composing herself for a voicemail when the line opened. "Hello," a woman's voice. Careful, the kind of careful that came not from shyness but from long practice. Ruth Ann introduced herself, her name, her city, the fact that she had gotten this number from a mutual professional contact. She said she was sorry to call without warning, and she meant it. She said she was calling because of a name, and she wanted to ask whether that name meant anything to the woman on the other end of the line. A pause. "What name?" the woman said. "James Fowler." The silence that followed lasted 5 full seconds. Ruth Ann counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when you're trying to hold yourself steady. "Who gave you my number?" the woman said. Ruth Ann explained again, more carefully this time. She said she was 67 years old. She said she had a daughter. She said her daughter was engaged to be married in 11 weeks, and she had reason to believe the man her daughter was marrying was not who he presented himself to be. She said she was not calling to cause harm. She was calling because she had run out of ways to pretend she wasn't worried. Another silence, shorter than the first. "My name is Claire," the woman said. "Claire Donnelly. I'm in Atlanta." "I know," Ruth Ann said. "Beverly told me your name, nothing else." A long breath on the other end of the line. "He used a different name with me," Claire said. "The first time, when I ran the name James Fowler last year, I almost didn't recognize it. There were small differences, different middle name, different background details, same face, different story. Ruth Ann set her coffee cup down slowly on the railing. Claire was 45. She had worked in marketing for a regional firm and had met him, a version of him, at a professional conference in Savannah 7 years ago. He had been attentive and perceptive and had remembered the names of her sisters after she mentioned them once in passing. They had dated for 8 months. Then he had proposed, and she had said yes. The engagement had lasted 14 months. During that time, they had opened a joint account for what he described as future planning a house. Eventually, in a neighborhood they had walked through twice and talked about as if it already belonged to them. Claire had transferred savings into the account in stages, amounts that felt reasonable, part of a shared life being assembled carefully. She had trusted him because he had given her every reason to trust him. That was the part she kept returning to, she said. Not that she had ignored warning signs. There had been no warning signs. Every concern she might have raised had been addressed before she thought to raise it. 8 weeks before the wedding, he was gone. She came home on a Thursday evening to an apartment that held only her things. His clothes, his books, the photograph of his parents he had kept on the nightstand, all of it absent, as if it had never been there. The joint account held $4.11. Ruth Ann listened without speaking. Claire had gone to the authorities. She had documented everything she could, the account, the transfers, the correspondence. But the transfers had been mutual. She had moved her own money, willingly, under her own name. He had made no false statements in writing. There was nothing on paper that said, "I will take this from you," only the fact of it afterward when the paper was gone. The civil process, Claire said, cost me more than I recovered. And then it went away. Ruth Ann asked if she had heard from him since. No, Claire said, but I've looked. I've been looking for 3 years because I know I wasn't the first, and I suspected I wouldn't be the last. The rocking chair had gone still. Ruth Ann was sitting with both feet flat on the porch floor, the paper in one hand and her phone in the other, and the morning was very quiet around her. She asked the question she had been carrying since she sat down. How long until your wedding when he left? A pause. 11 weeks, Claire said. Ruth Ann looked through the front door, across the hallway, to where the paper calendar hung on the kitchen wall. She had circled Stephanie's wedding date 2 days ago with a red pen because that was what you did when your daughter told you she was getting married. 11 weeks from today. The circles were the same size. She had spent 31 years learning to keep her face still. Not blank, blank was its own kind of signal. But still, composed in the particular way a nurse learned to be composed when a patient said something alarming, and the most useful thing she could offer in that moment was the appearance of calm. The face that said, "I hear you, and I am not afraid, and we are going to handle this together." She put on that face before she left the house that Saturday morning. The brunch was at a restaurant near the waterfront, Stephanie's suggestion. A place with large windows and small plates, and the kind of noise level that made it easy to let certain silences pass unnoticed. Ruth Ann arrived first, ordered water, and was looking at the menu she had already decided she wouldn't order from when they came through the door. Stephanie was wearing something yellow. She looked rested. James held the door for her, and then for the couple behind them, and the small gesture landed with the easy grace of a man who understood the value of being witnessed, doing the right thing at the right moment. They sat. The conversation moved through the standard channel's venue updates, guest list adjustments, a discussion about whether the ceremony should start at 4 or 4:30. Ruth Ann asked questions. She smiled at the right moments. She said, "That sounds lovely," twice, and "I'm so glad," once, and she meant some of it. But she was watching now with different eyes. She had always noticed James. That had never been the problem. The problem was that she had been watching for the wrong things, looking for gaps, for inconsistencies, for a moment when the performance slipped. What Claire had told her shifted the lens. She stopped looking for what was absent and started watching what was there. The way he answered questions directed at Stephanie, not always, not so consistently that it was obvious, but in a pattern, a rhythm of intervention so practiced that it passed for attentiveness. Stephanie would begin a sentence, and James would complete it gently with a smile, and Stephanie would nod as if that had been exactly what she was going to say. Sometimes it probably was, but the nod came a half beat too quickly, and it was the same nod each time, and Ruth Ann had spent enough years watching people respond to things they hadn't chosen to recognize compliance that had been dressed up as agreement. She also watched Stephanie's eyes. Before answering anything of substance where they were thinking of honeymooning, whether they had spoken to a photographer, what kind of flowers Stephanie wanted, there was a glance. Brief, habitual, so integrated into the rhythm of the conversation that it could have been mistaken for simply looking at the person you loved, but it moved in only one direction, always from Stephanie to James, never the other way. Checking in, or checking for permission, Ruth Ann was not yet certain which. She ate half a plate of eggs she didn't taste and drove home through the Saturday traffic, telling herself to be careful, to remain in the territory of what she knew rather than what she suspected. Evidence was not the same as instinct, even when instinct had a 31-year track record. She called Claire from the kitchen table. Claire answered on the second ring. She had clearly been expecting the call, or a call, because she moved quickly past pleasantries. Ruth Ann described the brunch, the sentence completions, the glances, the practiced grace of it all. Claire listened without interrupting. "Did he ask about her finances this time?" Claire said. "No," Ruth Ann said, "not directly." "He won't," Claire said. "Not yet. That comes later, when she's already in the habit of deferring." She asked if Ruth Ann had a way to receive a message on her computer. Ruth Ann said yes. She gave Beverly's contact information as a relay, not wanting anything sent directly to her own address. An hour later, a folder arrived. Beverly forwarded it without commentary. Inside were images, photographs of a phone screen, taken carefully, every message readable. Conversations between Claire and a man she had known by a slightly different version of the same name. The timestamps ran across 14 months. Ruth Ann spread them out in order the way she spread out patient records chronologically, looking for the shape of a thing before assigning it a name. The phrasing was unmistakable. At the end of the day. There. 3rd month in. It's about the bigger picture. 5th month. The same month Stephanie had started using it. "I just want to make sure you're protected." Ruth Ann set her coffee down. She read forward through the remaining images more slowly now. The language evolved warmer, then more directive, then intimate in a way that was less romantic and more architectural. Building something, calibrating it. She was near the end of the sequence when she found it. A message near the bottom of the final image. The date was 11 weeks before the wedding that had never happened. The message was short. "Your mother never has to know." Ruth Ann sat very still. She had heard those words 6 days ago. She had been standing in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs, and James had been on the front porch, and the night had carried his voice unevenly through the screen door. She had not known then what she was hearing. She knew now. The folder had been open on the kitchen table since 6 in the morning. Ruth Ann sat across from it the way she sometimes sat across from difficult paperwork, not reading, not yet, but letting her eyes rest on the surface of it while her mind completed the last of its overnight processing. The coffee beside her had been hot when she poured it. She didn't notice it going cold. Beverly had sent 3 additional pages late the previous evening, forwarded through the same relay, with a brief note that said only, "More than I expected. Call me when you're ready." Ruth Ann had read the pages twice before bed and twice more this morning. She was ready. She called Beverly at 8:15. Beverly answered the way she answered everything directly, without preamble. She had spent the past 4 days making careful inquiries through professional channels she declined to name specifically, and what she had found was not a single incident and not a coincidence. It was a pattern. The same general sequence across 3 different cities. Charleston was the most recent, but before Charleston there had been a woman in Raleigh, and before Raleigh a woman in Savannah. Different names on the accounts, different timelines. The same structure. Establish presence, build trust, introduce shared financial arrangements framed as planning, escalate contributions, and then at the point when the investment was most concentrated, dissolve. "He's careful," Beverly said. "Nothing rises to the level that triggers automatic review. Each individual transaction looks like what it's labeled." "How long does each one last?" Ruth Ann asked. "Long enough," Beverly said. "Long enough that no one questions it until it's already gone." Ruth Ann thanked her and sat with the folder for a long time after the call ended. She had contributed to this wedding the way mothers contributed, gradually, willingly, in the way of someone who considers it not a transaction but an expression of love. A deposit on the venue when Stephanie mentioned they were worried about losing the date. Half the catering estimate paid in 2 installments: the florist consultation fee, the engagement dinner, the rehearsal venue reservation that James had forwarded to her with a note saying Stephanie had mentioned she'd want to be involved. She had not added it up before. There had been no reason to. She added it up now. $34,000 spent. 18,000 promised deposits not yet due, commitments she had made in conversation or in writing over the past several weeks. $52,000 total, spread across enough line items that none of them had felt significant in isolation. She wrote the number on a piece of paper and looked at it. Then she folded the paper and placed it beneath the folder, face down. Stephanie called at 2:15 that afternoon. The conversation began with a few minutes of ordinary exchange: the weather, a small update about the venue's parking situation, a comment about a mutual friend's recent news. Then Stephanie said she'd been thinking about the remaining deposits. James thought it might be easier, Stephanie said, if the outstanding contributions went into one place, a joint account he set up for the wedding expenses. That way everything is consolidated, and we're not juggling multiple vendors. The phrasing was clean and practical, the kind of suggestion that, standing alone, sounded like good organizational sense. Ruth Ann had been listening to Stephanie's voice her entire life. She knew every register of it, the quick, bright tone of genuine excitement, the slightly lower pitch of someone asking for something they felt uncertain about, the careful evenness of a person relaying a message they had not composed themselves. This was the third one. "That's thoughtful," Ruth Ann said. "Let me take a few days to look at what I have outstanding and make sure I understand exactly what's going where. I want to be careful with the bookkeeping." A pause. "Of course," Stephanie said. "That makes sense." The call ended warmly enough. Ruth Ann set the phone down on the table beside the folder and sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. Her phone rang again. Not Stephanie's name this time. The number was different, local, but not one she had saved. She answered it because she answered numbers she didn't recognize the same way she had always answered the phone at the nursing station. Steadily, without assumption. Ruth Ann. Not a question. James's voice, measured and warm, arriving as if it belonged there. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." She said he wasn't. "I just wanted to make sure Stephanie explained everything clearly," he said, "about the account. I know it can seem like a lot of moving pieces, and I'd hate for there to be any confusion." He spoke the way he always spoke, unhurried, considerate, as if her comfort were the primary concern. She had once found that quality reassuring. She understood now that it was a tool the way a scalpel was a tool, precise, practiced, and useful only to the person holding it. "She explained it very well," Ruth Ann said. "I just like to take my time with financial decisions. Thomas always said that was one of my better habits." A brief pause. "Of course," James said. "Take all the time you need." After she ended the call, Ruth Ann sat without moving for a long moment. He had called her directly. He had never done that before. She looked at the folder on the table, at the folded piece of paper beneath it, at the number she had written in plain figures, and turned face down. The time for taking things slowly was almost gone. She had been careful for 2 months. Careful at dinner tables, careful on phone calls, careful in the particular way that required more energy than anyone who hadn't done it would understand the sustained effort of appearing exactly as expected while thinking about something else entirely. It was a skill she had developed over 31 years of nursing and refined over the past 8 weeks without choosing to. But there were things you couldn't learn from a folder on a kitchen table or a voice on the phone from Atlanta. There were things you could only learn by sitting across from your daughter without anyone else in the room. She called Stephanie on a Tuesday morning and asked if she wanted to get lunch. Just the two of them. She mentioned a cafe near Stephanie's office, the one they used to go to before James, before the engagement, before the calendar began filling with tasks that always seemed to include a third person. Stephanie said yes without hesitating, which was the first thing that felt genuine in some time. They agreed on Thursday at noon. Ruth Ann arrived early and chose a table in the back, away from the door. She ordered water and sat with her hands folded on the table and thought carefully about what she intended to say and how she intended to say it. She had one question. She had been carrying it for 11 days, since the morning she had read Claire's messages and understood that James Fowler operated not by accident but by design. She was going to ask it today. Stephanie came through the door at 5 past noon, unwinding a light scarf, scanning the room until she found her mother. She looked well-rested in a surface way that sometimes indicated the opposite underneath. She hugged Ruth Ann and sat down and picked up the menu, and they began the ordinary rhythm of a lunch between two people who loved each other and had not spoken honestly in too long. They talked about the venue's updated seating chart, about a bridesmaid's recent news, about whether the weather in late October would cooperate. 23 minutes after Stephanie arrived, the door opened. James came in with the ease of someone who belonged wherever he walked. He spotted them immediately, raised a hand in greeting, and crossed the room with a smile that arrived slightly ahead of him. "I had a meeting cancel," he said, pulling out the chair beside Stephanie before anyone spoke. "Figured I'd see if you two were still here." The meeting that had canceled, the location he had known without being told. Ruth Ann looked at her daughter and saw something flicker so briefly it might have been a trick of the light behind Stephanie's eyes. Not surprise, something closer to adjustment. The lunch proceeded. Ruth Ann kept her expression pleasant and her contributions to the conversation measured. James ordered coffee and talked about the venue's parking situation and a minor adjustment to the rehearsal schedule. He was, as always, perfectly calibrated. 40 minutes in, he excused himself. Ruth Ann watched him move toward the back of the restaurant and calculated the time she had. She looked at Stephanie. Has he ever mentioned a woman named Claire Donnelly? The change was immediate and involuntary, the kind of response the body produces before the mind has finished deciding how to respond. Stephanie's expression did not collapse. It did not shift dramatically. But it held, for one full second, the particular stillness of someone who had just heard something they were not prepared to hear. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't think so. Why?" Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. Ruth Ann had spent 31 years reading the difference between what people said and what their bodies remembered. She did not press. She simply held the question in the air between them for one moment longer, then said it was probably nothing, and reached for her water glass. James returned to the table 90 seconds later. The conversation resumed. The check arrived. They walked out together into the afternoon and said their goodbyes in the parking lot with the warmth of a family that had just shared a pleasant meal. Ruth Ann drove home with both hands on the wheel and her jaw set. The name had landed. She had seen it land. Whatever Stephanie said with her voice, the rest of her had recognized that name, and recognition was not the same as ignorance. The question now was what Stephanie was going to do with it. She found out at 8:47 that evening. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. A message from Stephanie. 4 words and a period, which was not how Stephanie usually wrote. Mom. Who is Claire Donnelly? Ruth Ann picked up the phone. She sat down at the table where the folder had been, where the coffee had gone cold, where she had looked at a number written in plain figures and turned it face down. She typed, "Someone I need to tell you about. Can we talk?" She deleted it. She typed, "A woman James was engaged to before you." She deleted that too. She sat for a long time with the blank response field open, the cursor blinking in the dark kitchen, and Biscuit asleep on the floor beside the chair. Then she put the phone in her cardigan pocket, picked up her keys from the hook beside the door, and walked out to the car. The drive to Charlotte took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Charlotte was 2 hours and 40 minutes from her front door, and Ruth Ann had made the drive in the dark without music, without the radio, without anything except the sound of the road and her own breathing, and the occasional pair of headlights coming the other way. She had not called ahead. Stephanie's building was a mid-rise on the east side of Uptown, the kind of place that had a lobby with a buzzer system and a doorman who worked until 10. Ruth Ann gave her daughter's name and watched the man behind the desk make a brief call. A pause. Then he nodded and handed her a visitor badge and told her the elevator was on the left. The hallway on the 7th floor was quiet. Most of the doors were closed. Light came from beneath a few of them, the ordinary light of people in their own lives doing ordinary things on a Thursday evening. She knocked on 714. The door opened after a moment. Stephanie was still dressed, which meant she hadn't been sleeping. Her eyes were the particular kind of dry that came after a long period of something other than crying the residue of a different kind of effort. She had clearly been looking. Ruth Ann had known she would be. Stephanie stepped back without speaking, and Ruth Ann came inside. The apartment was tidy in the careful way of someone who had recently made it so things in their places, surfaces clear, the kind of order that sometimes indicated the opposite in the spaces that weren't visible. A laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. The search field at the top of the screen held 2 words. Ruth Ann recognized them. They sat in the living room, on the sofa that faced the window. The city moved outside, distant and indifferent, all of it lit up and going about its business, while the 2 of them sat close enough that Ruth Ann could have reached over and taken her daughter's hand. She didn't yet. She started at the beginning. She told Stephanie about the account Beverly had flagged, the timing of it, the label on the transfers, the amounts that were small enough to avoid attention and consistent enough to constitute a record. She told her about the article from Atlanta, the name that had appeared once as a respondent in a civil matter that had been settled without public statement. She told her about calling Claire. She described Claire's voice, careful, practiced, the wariness of someone who had learned to be wary for good reason. She described the timeline Claire had given her: 14 months, a joint account opened for future planning, savings transferred in stages under a label that sounded like shared purpose. She described the Thursday evening when Claire had come home to find that what had been there was simply gone. She told Stephanie about the pattern Beverly had traced across 3 cities. Stephanie sat through all of it without speaking. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes mostly on the middle distance between them and the window, and she listened the way Ruth Ann had learned to listen in the hospital, completely, without interjecting, holding the information until the full shape of it was available. When Ruth Ann finished, the apartment was very quiet. Stephanie looked at the window for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me she was unstable." Ruth Ann waited. He mentioned her once. Early on, maybe 2 months in. He said there had been someone before me who hadn't handled the end of the relationship well, that she had made certain claims that weren't true. He said it was painful, and that he didn't like to talk about it. She paused. He said she was the reason he had learned to be careful about who he trusted. The words were precise enough to have been prepared. Ruth Ann recognized the architecture of them, the preemptive disclosure, the reframing, the subtle repositioning of the person most likely to cause trouble, as someone whose credibility was already compromised before she ever spoke. She reached into her cardigan pocket and took out her phone. She opened it to the screen where Claire Donnelly's number still sat, the way she had saved it the morning she dialed it for the first time, and she placed the phone on the cushion between them. Face up, the number visible. "Call her yourself," Ruth Ann said. Stephanie looked at the phone. She did not touch it. The city outside continued its business. A siren moved through the middle distance and faded. Biscuit was at home in Charleston, probably asleep on the kitchen floor by the back door, the way he always was by this hour. Stephanie's hands were still in her lap. The silence stretched long enough that Ruth Ann began to understand it was not the silence of someone gathering courage. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of something and looking down and understanding that stepping forward would change the ground beneath them permanently. When Stephanie finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "What if I don't want to know?" Ruth Ann looked at her daughter, at the face she had known longer than any other face in the world, and did not answer right away. Because it wasn't a refusal. It was the most honest thing Stephanie had said in months. The bedroom door closed with a sound that was softer than Ruth Ann expected. She sat at the kitchen counter and listened to the silence that followed. The laptop was still open on the counter across from her, the search field still visible, the 2 words Stephanie had typed still sitting there unanswered. Ruth Ann reached over and closed it, because it seemed like the right thing to do to remove from the room anything that represented the search that was already over and the one that was just beginning. Then she put the kettle on, because she needed something to do with her hands. The apartment was not large. She could hear the occasional small sound from behind the closed door, a creak of the floor, the brief, soft impact of something set down. Not crying, not voices raised, just the particular sounds of a person in a contained space doing something that required concentration and stillness simultaneously. Ruth Ann made 2 cups of tea and left them on the counter. She sat back down and looked at the city through the window, the way she had looked at many waiting rooms over the years, not at anything specific, just maintaining presence, staying available, not requiring the space around her to be anything other than what it was. She did not check her phone. She did not rehearse what she would say when Stephanie came out, because she had learned, over many years and in many rooms, that preparing what you would say in response to something you hadn't heard yet was a way of centering yourself in a moment that belonged to someone else. She waited. The clock on the microwave moved from 9:47 to 10:29. 42 minutes. The bedroom door opened. Stephanie came out the way people came out of rooms, where something significant had happened, not changed in a way that was visible in the ordinary sense, but carrying herself differently, as if the interior arrangement of something had shifted and she was still learning the new weight of it. She sat down across from Ruth Ann and looked at the 2 cups of tea. She knew what kind of car he drove, Stephanie said. I didn't tell you that because I didn't think it mattered. She described the car exactly, the year, the color, the dent above the passenger side wheel well. Ruth Ann didn't say anything. She said he always brought flowers to the first dinner at her mother's house. Stephanie's voice was even almost careful in the way of someone recounting something rather than processing it. He brought white ones, wrapped in brown paper. White flowers, brown paper. Ruth Ann thought of the counter in her own kitchen, the night of Stephanie's last dinner, the wrapped stems James had set down with the ease of someone who had done it before. She said he fixed a hinge on her mother's screen door without being asked. Stephanie looked at the table. First visit, he just noticed it and fixed it. The screen door on Ruth Ann's back porch. The one she had been meaning to address for months. The one that had, she now recalled, stopped squeaking sometime in October without her having done anything about it. She described the way he answers questions that are meant for someone else, Stephanie said. She used a specific phrase. She said he was good at completing your sentences before you knew what you were going to say. Ruth Ann set down her tea. She described him exactly. Stephanie's voice didn't break. It was something harder than breaking. It was the sound of someone assembling a truth piece by piece in real time, laying each one down with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this structure, once built, could not be unbuilt, word for word, down to the thing he says about waiting, feeling like habit instead of intention. She stopped. Ruth Ann reached across the counter and took her daughter's hand. She did not say, I told you. She did not say, I was right. She did not say any of the things that were available to her in that moment, and that would have been, in their own way, a form of taking something that didn't belong to her. She held her daughter's hand and let the silence be what it needed to be. After a while, Stephanie looked up. What do I do now, Mom? Ruth Ann thought of Thomas, who had faced hard things by sitting with them long enough to understand their actual shape before deciding how to move. She thought of 31 years of rooms where the most important thing she had ever offered was not an answer but a presence. That's up to you, she said. But whatever you decide, I'm here. Stephanie nodded once. Something in her shoulders released, slightly, the way tension releases when a person stops trying to carry something alone. They sat like that for a moment, 2 women in a kitchen in Charlotte, the city going quietly on outside, the tea cooling, the room holding them the way rooms sometimes did when what happened inside them mattered. Then they heard it, the small, distinct sound of a key entering a lock. The front door. Ruth Ann and Stephanie looked at each other across the kitchen counter, and in that look was everything that needed to be decided in the next 3 seconds. What to say, what not to say, and how to be in a room that had just changed completely, exactly as they needed to be. She drove back to Charleston in the dark. James had come home to find them in the kitchen with cold tea and the ordinary expressions of 2 women who had been catching up on nothing in particular. Ruth Ann had stayed 40 minutes longer, long enough to help Stephanie rinse the cups, long enough to say goodnight to James with the same measured warmth she had been practicing for 2 months, long enough to feel the pressure of everything unspoken pressing against the inside of a conversation that sounded, from the outside, like nothing at all. She had hugged Stephanie at the door and felt her daughter hold on for half a second longer than usual. Then she had driven home through the dark with the windows cracked and Biscuit waiting at the back door when she arrived at 1:30. The next morning she was in her own kitchen before 6, and the 5 days felt both very long and very short simultaneously. She had told Stephanie, in the parking lot of her building before she left quietly, with James still upstairs, that she would follow her daughter's lead, that she would not push, that whatever Stephanie needed from her in the days ahead, she would provide, and whatever Stephanie needed her not to do, she wouldn't. That was the only promise she made, and she meant it entirely. What that looked like, in practice, was this. Ruth Ann continued to be exactly who James believed her to be. She accepted a dinner invitation for Monday evening and arrived with a jar of the fig preserves she made every September, which was something she would have done in any other October of her life. She talked about the weather and the venue and whether the ceremony should include a unity candle. She laughed at 2 things James said that were genuinely worth laughing at, because he was intelligent and occasionally funny, and neither of those qualities had ever been the problem. She watched him the way she had learned to watch him, not looking for performance, but tracking patterns. The way he positioned himself between Stephanie and the door when they stood to leave. The way he answered her questions about Stephanie's preferences, as if they were his to answer. The small recalibrations he made when he sensed a conversation moving in a direction he hadn't initiated. Beverly worked from her end without announcement. She had a contact at a county records office in Raleigh who owed her a favor from a refinancing dispute 3 years prior. On Tuesday afternoon, she called Ruth Ann from her car, which meant she was being careful, and said she had confirmed the Raleigh account. Same structure, different woman. The timing fit a window between Claire and Stephanie. He moves every 2 to 3 years, Beverly said. Long enough to establish, not long enough to be connected. Claire had called once, briefly, Mimon. She had spoken with a legal advocate and was prepared to make a formal account if it came to that. She used the word prepared the way someone used a word they had chosen deliberately, and Ruth Ann understood that it had cost her something to get to that word, and she did not make her explain it. Stephanie said nothing for 3 days. Ruth Ann did not press. She sent one ordinary text each day, a photograph of the hydrangeas, a note about a book she was reading, a question about whether Stephanie had decided on the rehearsal dinner location. The texts of a mother who was thinking about her daughter without requiring anything back. On the third night, at 11:14, her phone rang. Stephanie's voice was low, not distressed, controlled, in the specific way of someone in a room where they could not be fully private and had called anyway because they had run out of ways to wait. "He asked me to sign something tonight," she said. "He said it was a formality. Something about consolidating the accounts before the wedding so the transfers would go smoothly afterward." Ruth Ann sat up in bed. "What kind of document?" she said, keeping her voice the same temperature it had been when she answered. "He called it a financial coordination form. I've never heard that phrase before." Ruth Ann had not heard it either. It did not sound like a phrase that existed in any standard documentation she was aware of, which meant it was either highly specialized or it was a label someone had chosen because it sounded unremarkable. "Did you sign it?" Ruth Ann said. Briefpause. "No," Stephanie said. "I told him I was tired, that I'd look at it in the morning." "Good," Ruth Ann said. "That was the right thing." Another pause, longer. "Mom." Stephanie's voice dropped further. "I'm scared." "I know," Ruth Ann said. "So am I. A little. But we're still thinking clearly, and that matters more right now." They said goodnight. Ruth Ann sat in the dark for a moment after the call ended, then got up and went to the kitchen and looked at the calendar. 2 days. She was still standing there when her phone lit up on the counter. Beverly. A message, not a call, which meant it was something she wanted in writing. "Ruth Ann. Pattern goes further back than we thought. There's a third woman, Savannah, 10 years ago." Ruth Ann read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the counter next to the calendar and stood in her kitchen in the dark and thought about a man who had been doing this for at least a decade, moving city to city with a practiced ease that only came from having done something many times. 2 days. The house was quiet in the way. It was only quiet after midnight. Not the daytime quiet of empty rooms or the early evening quiet of a neighborhood settling into itself, but the particular stillness of the small hours when the street outside held no movement, and the sounds of the house itself, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the low cycling of the refrigerator became the only measure of time passing. Ruth Ann sat in the living room with the lamp off. Thomas's chair was beside her, the way it had always been beside her, the green fabric worn thin on the armrests in the places his hands had rested most. She had not moved it in 8 years. She was not going to move it tonight. Beverly called at 11:30. She had spent the past 48 hours compiling what she described, in her precise and unembellished way, as the complete picture. The woman in Savannah had been first a schoolteacher, 62 now, who had reported an irregularity to a financial oversight office 10 years ago. The complaint had been acknowledged and filed, and nothing further had come of it because the amounts had been just below the threshold that triggered formal investigation and because the woman had, eventually, stopped pursuing it. The woman in Raleigh had come next, a recently widowed property owner whose modest estate had been partially liquidated before she understood what was happening. The civil matter in Atlanta had been Claire. 3 women, 3 cities, a span of 10 years. "It's a consistent record," Beverly said. consistent enough that anyone with access to the full picture would find it significant. Is it enough? Ruth Ann asked. For a formal report to the relevant authorities? Yes, it won't move quickly. These things rarely do. But the record exists, and it's documentable, and the right office would take it seriously. Ruth Ann looked at the dark window across the room. The wedding is at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said. I know, Beverly said. They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking, the way old friends sometimes did when the thing that needed to be said had already been understood. Thank you, Ruth Ann said, for all of it. After she hung up, she sat with the silence again. She thought about the schoolteacher in Savannah who had filed a complaint and stopped pursuing it. She wondered what that had cost her, not the money, which was its own particular loss, but the stopping. The moment when a person weighed what it would take to keep going against what they had left to give and chose to put it down. Ruth Ann did not judge that choice. She had sat beside enough people in enough difficult rooms to understand that survival sometimes looked like retreat, and that retreat was not the same as defeat. She also thought about Claire, who had not stopped, who had kept the records and made the calls, and 3 years later, answered the phone when a stranger from Charleston dialed her number on a Tuesday morning from a front porch rocking chair. And she thought about Stephanie. She got up and went to the bedroom and took the photograph from the dresser, the one from the small wooden box with the brass clasp. Not the wedding rings this time. The photograph that had sat beside the box for 8 years, framed in plain wood. Herself and Thomas on the front porch of this house, the summer Stephanie turned 12, the three of them in the ordinary arrangement of a family that did not yet know what was coming and was simply living inside a good day. Thomas was smiling at the camera. She was smiling at Thomas. She had asked him once, early in their marriage, how he always seemed to know what to do when things were hard. He had thought about it for a moment. Thomas always thought before he answered, which was one of the things she had loved most about him, and then he said, I don't always know what to do. I just know what I can't leave undone. She set the photograph on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed. Her phone rang at 12:47. Stephanie. She answered before the second ring. Mom. Her daughter's voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the steadiness of someone who had arrived at the other side of a decision. I need you to come over. Tonight. Ruth Ann was already standing. I'll be there in 2.5 hours, she said. Okay, Stephanie said. And then, after a pause, thank you. The drive felt different from the first one. The first time she had driven to Charlotte in the dark, she had been running towards something uncertain. This time, the road felt more like a line being drawn, deliberate, directed, the kind of movement that came after everything else had already been decided. She arrived at the building at 3:21. The night doorman, a different man from the last time, processed her visitor badge without comment. The elevator rose quietly. She knocked on 714. Stephanie opened the door. She was dressed not in pajamas, not in the clothes of someone interrupted mid-sleep, but in the jeans and gray sweater of someone who had been awake and waiting. Her face was composed in the way of someone who had used the last several hours to reach the floor of something and had found it solid. Behind her, in the space between the kitchen counter and the bedroom door, were 2 pieces of luggage. Packed, closed. Ruth Ann looked at them, and then at her daughter. Stephanie stepped back to let her in. I found the document he wanted me to sign, she said. I went looking for it after we talked. He'd left it in the folder on his desk. She paused. Mom, it wasn't a formality. Ruth Ann looked at the luggage for one moment, 2 pieces, dark gray, the zipper pulls still perfectly aligned, and then she looked at her daughter. She sat down on the sofa. She did not ask what was in the document. She did not ask what Stephanie was planning to do. She had learned, in the last several weeks, that the most important thing she could offer was not direction but room to arrive at things, room to say them, room to have them received without being immediately processed into someone else's response. She waited. Stephanie sat down across from her and folded her hands in her lap, the way she had sat as a child when she was preparing to explain something she had thought about carefully. He brought the paperwork out again after dinner, she said. He said he'd had a chance to look it over one more time and it was straightforward. He put it on the table and handed me a pen. She had taken the pen. She had sat with the document in front of her and read it the way she had been trained, by a decade of working in a professional environment, to read documents that required her signature beginning to end, every clause, every defined term. What it described was not a financial coordination form. It was a broad authorization, her name, James's name, and a set of permissions that would have allowed him to act on her behalf across every financial account she held to transfer, to withdraw, to close, to consolidate. The language was careful and layered, the kind of careful that came from someone who had written something like it before and understood where the plainest phrasing would cause a person to stop and read more closely. She had read it twice. Then she had set the pen down on the table. "I told him I was too tired to concentrate properly," Stephanie said, "that I wanted to make sure I understood everything before I signed anything the night before our wedding. He had said, of course, that it could wait until after, that there was no urgency. He had said it the way he said most things reasonably, without resistance, leaving no surface to push against. She had waited until she could hear his breathing change. Then she had gotten up in the dark and packed 2 bags, the things that were hers, the things that mattered, the things that fit into the space she could carry, and she had sat in the kitchen and waited for her mother. Ruth Ann listened to all of it without speaking. When Stephanie finished, the apartment was very quiet. "You did everything right," Ruth Ann said. It was not a complicated thing to say, but Stephanie closed her eyes when she heard it, briefly, the way a person closed their eyes when something they had been waiting for finally arrived. They sat in the kitchen until the light outside the window changed from dark to the gray of very early morning. They talked, and then they didn't talk, and then they talked again, the ordinary rhythm of 2 people keeping each other company through the long hours before a day that was going to require a great deal from both of them. At 7 in the morning, Stephanie picked up her phone. She called the venue first, then the caterer, then the photographer, then the florist, the officiant, and the car service. Each call was brief. Her voice did not waver. She explained that the event was canceled, that she was sorry for the late notice, and that she understood if deposits were non-refundable. She did not explain further. She did not owe further explanation to anyone she was paying. After the vendors, she sent a message to the guests. 63 people. She wrote it once, read it once, and sent it. Then she called a lawyer, whose name Beverly had provided 2 weeks ago. On the same afternoon, she had called Ruth Ann from her car to say she was being careful. Ruth Ann sat at the kitchen counter through all of it. She did not make the calls. She did not compose the messages. She did not contact the lawyer or manage the list or hand Stephanie the next task. She sat close enough that Stephanie could look up and find her there, and she stayed out of the way of everything her daughter was doing, because what Stephanie was doing was not something that needed to be done for her. It needed to be done by her. By 9:47, 13 minutes before the ceremony would have started, Stephanie set the phone face down on the counter. James had called 47 times. Stephanie had not answered once. They sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, the city outside beginning its Saturday morning without them, and Ruth Ann thought about the photograph on her nightstand at home, herself and Thomas and a 12-year-old Stephanie on the porch of the house on a summer day that none of them had known was good until it was over. She thought Stephanie was going to be all right. Not immediately. Not without the long and difficult work of what came next. But in the way that mattered fundamentally. In the place where a person's understanding of themselves lived, she was going to be all right. 1 week later, a letter arrived at Ruth Ann's house in Charleston. She recognized the return address before she opened it. The city in Georgia, the specific federal office, the formal abbreviation she had been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. She opened it at the kitchen table, in the morning light, with her coffee still warm. Regarding James Allen Fowler ongoing investigation. She read the single paragraph twice. Then she set it down and looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree Thomas had planted the year Stephanie was born. It was still standing. The garden had not changed. The hydrangeas along the porch railing were past their peak now. October had taken the last of their color, leaving the dried heads and shades of pale paper and old rust that Ruth Ann had always preferred to the full bloom because they held their shape through winter, and reminded her that things could persist beautifully without requiring anything further from you. She and Stephanie had been sitting out here for the better part of an hour, doing very little. Stephanie had a cup of tea. Ruth Ann had her coffee. Biscuit was in the yard, occupied with something near the base of the oak tree, thoroughly uninterested in either of them. It was the first afternoon in a long time when there was nothing that needed deciding. The weeks since had moved in the way that weeks moved after something large, not quickly, not slowly, but unevenly, some days feeling long and others feeling as if they had happened without her. The formal process that Beverly had set in motion before the wedding was continuing in the quiet, deliberate way of institutional things. Ruth that gane mari, that K my, that gane, that game ladder. That's brief as the first confirming that the matter was active and that she might be contacted for further documentation. She had filed it with the first letter in the folder she kept for things she did not want to lose. Claire had called once, 2 weeks after everything, to say that someone had finally taken a formal account. Her voice on the phone had a quality Ruth Ann hadn't heard in it before, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a person who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally been permitted to set it down in a place where it would be held. Beverly had received a card and a jar of fig preserves and had called to say the preserves were exceptional and that Ruth Ann was not to make a fuss. Ruth Ann had made no fuss. Stephanie had started seeing someone, a therapist recommended by the lawyer Beverly had connected her with, a woman Stephanie described, after the third session, as very direct, which I think is what I need right now. She went every week. She did not report back in detail, and Ruth Ann did not ask, because some rooms were not meant to have observers. What Ruth Ann watched instead was the smaller things. The way Stephanie had started finishing her own sentences again. The way she reached for the salt at dinner without waiting to see if anyone else wanted it first. The way she laughed at something on the drive to the farmer's market 2 Saturdays ago, a genuine laugh, unexpected, the one that started in her chest before her face had decided to join it. Ruth Ann had been driving and had not turned to look because some things were better witnessed peripherally, the way you watch something rare and likely to startle. The afternoon had gone quiet and golden in the way of late October, when the light came in at an angle that made everything look considered. Stephanie was looking at the oak tree. "Mom," she said, "how did you know something was wrong from the very first night?" Ruth Ann held her coffee with both hands. It was not a simple question. It had a simple answer, but simple answers were not always the honest ones, and this one deserved honesty. She thought about the first Sunday dinner, James's flowers arriving too precisely, his smile landing slightly ahead of the warmth it was meant to carry. She thought about the way she had stood at the kitchen sink afterward, drying a pan that was already dry, running Thomas's words through her mind the way you ran a familiar route when you needed to think. "It wasn't a single thing," she said. "It was the eyes." Stephanie looked at her. Ruth Ann set her cup down and stood up from the garden chair, not quickly, but with the deliberateness of someone who had decided something. She gestured toward the back door. "Come inside for a minute." They went through the kitchen and into the living room. The afternoon light came through the front windows at the low angle it took in October, laying itself across the floorboards in long shapes. Biscuit padded in behind them and settled near the entrance, apparently deciding this required supervision. Ruth Ann stopped beside the green wingback chair. She did not touch it. She simply stood beside it, the way she always stood beside it, close enough to be near it, careful enough not to disturb it, and looked at Stephanie. "He sat in this chair the first night," she said, without asking, without noticing that it was the only chair in the room that had never been sat in by anyone but your father. Stephanie was looking at the chair now. A person who truly sees the people around them notices those things, not because they've been told, because they pay attention in a way that has no agenda. She paused. His attention always had an agenda. That's what his eyes gave away. "You can rehearse everything else." Stephanie was quiet for a long moment. "Your father taught me that," Ruth Ann said. "Eyes don't lie, smiles do." The room held them both. Stephanie stood beside the chair and looked at it for a long time, at the worn armrests, the familiar shape of it, the way it sat in the afternoon light as it had sat for 8 years, unchanged, waiting for no one. Then, slowly, she sat down in it. Not heavily, not with any drama, gently, the way you sat in a space that belonged to someone you loved and wanted to be close to, with the particular care of someone asking permission from a person who was no longer there to give it. Ruth Ann watched her daughter settle into her father's chair. She did not say anything. Some moments did not need words. 3 months had a different quality than 3 weeks. 3 weeks after something large, you were still in the immediate territory of it, still reflexively reaching for the shape of what had changed, still adjusting your weight to the new arrangement of things. 3 months was different. 3 months was when the changed thing had quietly become the ordinary thing, and you woke up one morning and realized that the life you were living now was simply your life, without qualifier. Ruth Ann had been thinking about that distinction on the morning she found the box. She had been moving things in the spare bedroom, a task she had been postponing for the better part of 2 years, and the box had been on the shelf behind the winter blankets, unmarked, the kind of plain cardboard that suggested practical storage rather than anything sentimental. Inside were the expected things: a set of cufflinks Thomas had worn to Stephanie's college graduation, a pocket dictionary so worn it had lost its cover, 2 receipts for things so old they had faded to pale shadows of themselves. And at the bottom, folded once, a piece of paper in Thomas's handwriting. She had carried it outside without reading it, because the morning was clear and cold in the particular way of January in Charleston, not bitterly cold, just enough to sharpen the air, and she had wanted to read it in the light, rather than in the dim interior of a room. Stephanie was already in the garden when she came out. This had become a quiet pattern over the past several weeks, Stephanie arriving before 8 on Sunday mornings, letting herself in with the key Ruth Ann had given her the November after everything, settling into the green wingback chair that Ruth Ann had moved to the back porch in December because Stephanie had mentioned once, carefully, that she liked being outside in the mornings. The chair looked right out here. Thomas might have agreed. Ruth Ann sat in the garden chair beside her and held the folded paper in both hands. The investigation had concluded its first phase. A letter had arrived in November, more detailed than the 2 before it, formal, in the precise way of official correspondence, confirming that James Allen Fowler had been formally charged on multiple counts related to financial misconduct across 3 states. Claire Donnelly had been notified. Ruth Ann had called her that afternoon, and Claire had answered and said very little, and then said thank you in a way that contained 10 years of waiting. A partial recovery had been arranged for Claire through the civil process Beverly had quietly shepherded from a distance. It was not everything. It rarely was. But it was something, and something, Ruth Ann had learned, was not nothing. Stephanie had returned to work in November. She was still seeing her therapist every week, which she described as hard and necessary, in the same way that physical therapy is hard and necessary. She had started cooking again, not just eating, but actually cooking, the way she had cooked in her 20s, with more ambition than precision and a willingness to make a mess. She had called Ruth Ann twice in the past month, just to talk, the way she used to call before any of this, the calls that had no agenda and lasted 45 minutes and covered everything and nothing. Ruth Ann watched the light come up over the garden. She unfolded the paper. Thomas's handwriting was immediately recognizable, the particular slope of it, the way his letters leaned slightly forward as if they were in a mild hurry, the careful pressure of a man who had always written as if the page deserved consideration. The paper was dated 3 months into their first year of marriage, which made it 35 years old, though it had not yellowed the way she would have expected. It had simply waited. She read it once. Then she sat with it for a moment before she read it again. The ones who love you don't just say it. They show up when it's hardest. That's the whole thing, Ruth. That's all of it. She looked at the words for a long time. She thought about Beverly, who had made calls from her car because she was being careful. About Claire, who had kept her records for 3 years and answered the phone when a stranger called from Charleston on a Tuesday morning. About Stephanie, who had sat in a kitchen in Charlotte until 3 in the morning and then, at 7, picked up the phone and made 63 calls she had not wanted to make. She thought about herself not proudly, not with any particular satisfaction, but plainly, the way you thought about what you had done when you were trying to understand it honestly. She had been a woman who noticed something and did not look away. She had been a woman who drove to Charlotte in the dark because her daughter needed her, and she was not willing to be the kind of person who waited until morning. She thought that was enough. She thought, actually, it was everything. Beside her, Stephanie had her eyes closed against the January light, her hands around her tea, her shoulders easy in a way that had taken 3 months to arrive. She was here. She was all right. Ruth Ann folded the paper back along its original crease and held it loosely in her hand. If you have ever watched someone you love find their way back to themselves, you understand what I mean when I say there are no words adequate to that particular relief. You just sit beside them in the morning light and let it be what it is. There is a question I want to ask you before you go. If you had been in Ruth Ann's position watching from the beginning, carrying what she carried, unsure whether your daughter would believe you, would you have done what she did? Or would you have stayed quiet to protect the relationship and hoped you were wrong? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your answer below, And if you're watching from somewhere outside Charleston, whether that's across the country or across the world, tell me where. It means more than you might think to know where these stories land. If you want to hear what happens to the people who find their way through the hardest things, stay close. There's more to tell.